I am Major Tagawa Toshimichi. Welcome to the 4th Fleet Headquarters in Truk. I will be your adjutant during our South Seas campaign. The General Staff and the Imperial Navy have pledged their support to your headquarters and have wished you luck in executing Operation MO. Our enemies are currently in control of Guadalcanal and Port Moresby, and the latest intelligence reports place an American carrier group at their base in Noumea. Your staff and I await your commands.
Hello everyone, this is Keith from the Solo Gamers Club and welcome to my channel. Embark with me on a journey back to the summer of 1942 as we revisit the monumental Pacific War through the engaging gameplay of Tetsuya Nakamura's acclaimed board game, Fire in the Sky, The Great Pacific War, 1941 to 1945. 7 months have elapsed since the war's onset. In the wake of Japan's swift and expansive strikes throughout the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942, the United States Navy has delivered a devastating setback to Japanese naval aviation at the Battle of Midway, sinking the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, a loss that Japan can never replace. As Japan licks its wounds, it initiates an intense campaign to seize control of the Solomon Islands and the Allied stronghold at Port Moresby. Should their efforts prevail, the vital communication routes between the U.S. West Coast and Australia could be severed. So join me in reenacting one of the most pivotal conflicts of World War II as we engage in Scenario 6, the Guadalcanal Campaign. This is a 2-turn scenario beginning in July 1942 and concluding in December 1942. This scenario uses special rules and victory is scored using a specific set of conditions. For this scenario, we're going to be using only a portion of the game map. Playable area in the game map is basically from Palau south and from Palau east towards Pearl Harbor. The only exception is Kure will be used in the game as a staging area for Japanese forces that will come in as reinforcements. I'll bring up a table that'll show the scenario victory conditions, and by glancing at that we find out that Japanese victory will occur if the final victory point total is greater than 2, and an Allied victory if less than -2. Otherwise, it'll be a draw. Japanese will gain victory points for the control of Guadalcanal or Port Moresby, 6 victory points each, and then the control of any other Allied base would be 3 victory points. Allied victory points would consist of Rabaul, 12 victory points, Port Moresby 8, and Guadalcanal 6. And then both players will also score victory points for sinking enemy carriers, damaging enemy carriers, sinking enemy light carriers, battleships, and cruisers, and eliminating land units. And also this scenario uses something called initiative. The game begins with Japan having initiative, and they're able to spend that once per combat round. A side with initiative may re-roll any number of dice after the dice roll, or force their opponent to do the same. When that is used, the initiative is passed to the other player and may be used in the same manner but not in the same turn. If Japan retains initiative at the end of the game, it's worth 2 victory points. This scenario uses several special rules. One of them is that we will have dedicated oil and transport factors for each turn. There will be no merchantman phases, as the oil and transport points received by Japan are fixed. Also, U.S. submarines are assumed to be committed to attacking Japanese merchantmen. The Allied player does not get any submarine points during this scenario. Japanese deployment has a special condition. It says Japanese units starting in Kure or arriving there as reinforcements must first deploy to Truk Lagoon before they can be entered into the game. Japanese have a special unit, and that is in the Gilberts. That's considered to be an Erzak over Tarawa, but that air group is not able to be moved in the campaign. We have to leave it there. So all that does is it serves as an AZOC to disrupt the U.S. plans. The game will also be using optional rules in the scenario. For the Allies, it'll be gentlemen do not read other people's mail and Semper Fi. For the Japanese, it'll be Long Lance torpedoes, Tokyo Express, and I Want It All. The scenario begins with the Japanese in control of Leh and Rabaul. The Allies have control of Port Moresby and Guadalcanal. So with the victory point schedule that we have, this basically forces the Japanese onto the offensive because the Allies control Port Moresby and Guadalcanal. Japanese forces consist of the Kawaguchi Brigade in Leh, the Achiki Brigade, and 4 airpoints, along with 2 cruisers and a destroyer in Rabaul. At Truk Lagoon, that is our headquarters, we have 1 airpoint, the Special Naval Landing Force Brigade, the aircraft carrier Shokaku and Zuikaku, the light carrier Zuiho and Shoho, battleship Heiai and Kirishima, cruiser Mogami, cruiser Tone, and 2 destroyers. That's their primary force in the area. There's also an air wing in Palau. And finally, beginning the game in Kure, we have the 6th Division, along with the light carriers Hosho and Ryuho, battleship Kongo and Horana, and 2 destroyers. Now those forces can't be activated from Kure. They have to be moved during the first deployment to Truk, and then they can be activated from there. That's in the special rules. Opposing the Japanese at Port Moresby, we have the Australian 30th Brigade and 1 factor of land-based aircraft. In Townsville, there's 2 factors of land-based aircraft. Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division, has landed. They've kicked out the Japanese engineers that were attempting to build an airstrip at what the U.S. is calling Henderson Field. 2 aircraft in Espiritu Santo. Noumea has 1 aircraft along with a carrier battle group consisting of the Lexington and Saratoga, cruiser Portland, cruiser New Orleans, the light cruiser anti-aircraft platform, the Atlanta, and 2 destroyers. In Samoa, we have the 8th New Zealand Brigade and an air wing. And finally, at Pearl Harbor, we have the 2nd Marine Division, 2 factors of land-based aircraft, and another carrier battle group consisting of the Wasp and Hornet, battleships North Carolina and Washington, light cruiser Omaha, and 1 destroyer flotilla. And that is the starting assets for both sides. The game is only 2 turns long. We're going to begin the game in July of 1942, and it will end the conclusion of turn 5. Reinforcements for both sides consist of the 25th Infantry Division and a destroyer and light cruiser for the U.S. For Japan, it is the 2nd Infantry Division and a battleship, the Yamato and Musashi, aircraft carrier Junyo and Hio, and a destroyer. That will be the extent of all of the forces that will be in this scenario. Japan begins the scenario with 16 transport points and 18 oil, while the U.S. will start with 26 transport points. During turn 5, Japan will have 28 transport points and 19 oil. The U.S. will have 32 transport points. And as I said previously in the open, the U.S. tactical subs will not be available, but the Japanese will have 2 sub points at the start of each turn. Now for this scenario, we're going to skip the first several phases of the sequence of play, and we're going to go move right into operational movement for Japan. Forces on the board are considered to have already used their first deployments. Now Japan is somewhat on the horns of a dilemma. In order to generate enough victory points to win the scenario, they're probably going to have to take both Port Moresby and Guadalcanal. It is dependent upon how many ships will be lost during the campaign, of course, and that will also change the victory point totals. But we have to decide on how we're going to handle this. Now, we have barely enough forces for probably one invasion, and we do have the threat of the U.S. using that special ability that they have. Men do not read other people's mail. So that would be considered to be like the U.S. signal intelligence efforts, and they would have broken the code, and they would know that the Japanese are planning a operation, and that would allow them to move that force in Pearl Harbor closer to the campaign area and then use that as a reaction force. We don't know if the U.S. is going to do that or not, but that's a definite possibility. To counter that, Japan has the initiative, and we would be able to force a reroll of our dice or of the opponent's dice and then give up that initiative to the other side if we use that. Now, if I could, I would be ordering the Kawaguchi Brigade to cross the Owen Stanley Ridge and attack Port Moresby, but we can't do that because we are in the operational phase and we're not allowed to cross any of those hexsides during this phase. So our choices would be to launch an attack, an amphibious invasion, possibly using the Special Naval Landing Force that we have up in Truk, along with a carrier support group, and moving that down to Port Moresby. But that will invite a possible reaction, of course, from the U.S. carrier forces in Noumea, and possibly they could use that special rule that would allow to use the Wasp and Hornet carrier group, and they could ambush us. So this is a very delicate decision as to what we want to do here. We also have to be careful because the U.S. could technically, as a counter move, if we don't attack Guadalcanal, they have the 1st Marine Division there, they could launch an amphibious invasion on Rabaul. And if they get that, the scenario will be lost. They're going to gain 12 victory points from that. So we have to take this, these considerations very carefully. And I think what I'm going to do is Operation MO is going to be centered on Port Moresby. So what we're going to do is create an invasion force in Truk. It's going to consist of the Special Naval Landing Force and a destroyer. That will be one group. And we're going to form that into a task force. Now that's going to cost us a total of 1 oil point and 4 transport points. And that's going to move 1, 2, and 3 into Port Moresby. So we'll make those subtractions on our chart. That's going to leave us with 17 oil and 12 transport points. We're going to also need, I think, carrier support group. So we're going to activate the Shokaku and Zuikaku. And I'm wondering if we should leave a carrier behind, the Zuiho and Shoho. Otherwise, if we commit those now, we won't have any ability to react to U.S. movements. So I think we're going to leave that behind. And we're going to include a battleship for anti-aircraft, and a cruiser and a destroyer. So we're going to activate that force as a carrier force. And that is going to cost us a total of 4, 8, 9, 10, 11 oil points. And that's going to move 1, 2, 3 into Port Moresby, and we have to subtract 11 oil points. And that leaves us with 6 oil. And I think we're also going to include a bombardment group coming out of Rabaul. And we have to decide what we want to do here. We have 2 cruisers and a destroyer. We have enough fuel to commit that entire force. But like I said, once again, we have no reactive forces here. So if we commit all this, so I have to be careful. And I'm wondering if we should just commit. Well, that's a tough decision. I guess we'll commit the entire thing. I'm going to activate that entire force. That's going to be a total of 5 oil. And we will commit that to the Port Moresby operation as well. That's going to leave us with a total of 1 oil remaining. See, now the problem with that is the Japanese have to spend oil during reactions. So we would only have 1 oil remaining for reactions, and even if I have ships available, I won't be able to form a reaction task force with that. So that does complicate stuff. Well, we're going to go with this. So I think that is going to be the operational moves for Japan. Now we have to move on to the U.S. reaction phase.
Sir, your battle plan for the invasion of Port Moresby is sound. The Imperial Navy, supported by Army ground-based aircraft from Rabaul, should be able to gain air superiority, and thus land the Special Naval Landing Force for the attack.
Now, to help me in deciding the moves for the Allies, I've created this oracle. And I've used this in the previous video I have on the game. And basically we have 3 columns: likely, 50-50, and unlikely. That would be the probability of that action occurring. And then a D12 roll would tell us whether or not the action will be approved, and if so, as to what strength it would be. First decision is the U.S. has to decide before we begin the reaction phase if they're going to use that special rule, gentlemen do not read other people's mail, and utilize their signal intelligence and attempt to ambush this operation in Port Moresby. I would think that the U.S. this would probably be a likely occurrence for them to try this, because given the opportunity to ambush this force, I think would be probably a likely occurrence. Now the problem is, once the U.S. does this, they use up that opportunity for the rest of the scenario, and they would have no operational surface assets in the area during their part of the turn. So we'll have to see what happens. We'll make the roll, and we'll use the likely column and see what happens. We're looking basically for this for either a yes or no. The roll is a 3, and that says no. So they will not be using that special rule at this time. So in that case, the U.S. is limited to the forces in theater. Forces in Pearl Harbor are too far away to react. And so the United States is going to activate this entire force in Noumea, and we have to decide now if they want to have this as a single carrier task force, or if they want to divide it into a surface bombardment group and a carrier force. And that one is kind of a tough decision. I think they would need to divide it, but we'll let the Oracle decide. Our first question for the Oracle is, does the United States want to create a surface group to contest the landings? I think this would be a 50-50, and we're looking just for a yes or no. The roll is a 6, and that's no. So that means that the U.S. is going to have all of those ships strictly into a carrier group. So that's what we're going to do. So the United States will form a carrier task force in Noumea, consisting of the Lexington Saratoga, cruiser Portland, cruiser New Orleans, the anti-aircraft light cruiser Atlanta, and 2 destroyers. So that force is going to sail from Noumea and react into the Port Moresby invasion area. So that is what we have. Next portion of the turn is air commitments. Japan is going to commit its entire air arm that it has in Rabaul, and it will commit 4 land-based aircraft units using long-ranged air from Rabaul to support their landings. And now we'll move to the combat step, and we're going to set this up on the battle board. All right, we've set the forces up on the battle board. Japan has a total of 6 air points that consists of the 4 carrier-based squadrons from the Shokaku and Zuikaku, and a total of 2 air points, 1/2 the total for long-range aircraft, giving them 6. The Allies have 1 point of Australian Air Force land-based aircraft on Port Moresby, and 4 factors of carrier-based aircraft from the Lexington and Saratoga. So we have a 6-5 advantage for Japan. We'll begin with the submarine attack phase. Japan has 2 factors of submarine forces that they can bring into the battle. Now there's only 1 task force to attack, so only 1 of those tactical subs will be able to be used. And Japan will commit 1 of their tactical subs to attacking the carrier battle group. The United States will make their anti-submarine warfare role, and they have a total of, I believe, 2 destroyers in the area. Yes. So the Benham and Farragut class destroyers will attempt to use anti-submarine warfare against the Japanese tactical submarines. They're going to get 2 dice, and they're going to gain a +1 on these rolls because there are aircraft in the area. So they'll be adding 1 to the roll. Here is the die roll. And they have failed. They've rolled a 2 and a 3 modified. So that means that the Japanese tactical subs have a firing solution on one of the ships in the task force, and obviously they are going to target the Lexington and Saratoga. So Japan will make their torpedo run on the Lexington and Saratoga. Single die roll, no modifiers. They're looking for a 5 or 6, and that is going to hit the carrier. The roll is a 3, so those torpedoes missed, and the tactical submarine creeps away unsuccessful. Now we're going to move into the battle segments, and we'll begin with air combat. Japan is going to be rolling 6 dice, the Allies 5. Japan will be rolling the white dice and the Allies the blue. And there'll be no modifiers on this, so here is the roll. All right. Japan has done pretty well. They have inflicted a total of 3 losses on U.S. air arm. The United States has only inflicted 1. So we'll make those adjustments. That means that Japan's available strike aircraft are now at 5. The U.S. is down to 2. So Japan will have a total of 5 strike aircraft, and the Allies will have 2. Now, as Japan has an advantage in tactical aircraft, that's going to give them air superiority, and we will mark that accordingly. The side that does not have air superiority must commit its forces first, and the U.S. has to make a decision. Do they commit their limited amount of strike aircraft to go after the landing forces, or do they launch an attack on the carrier battle group that is supporting them? And I think the U.S. will use the Oracle to decide on their target. And I think it would be likely that they would go after, it's really tough. I mean, it's a 50-50 really, whether they would go after the transports or the carrier. I don't think they would pass on an opportunity to take out a carrier. So I'm going to make this a 50-50, and the question will be, does the U.S. attack the carrier group? And we're looking just for a yes or no. Result is a 5, and that's no. So in that case, the U.S. aircraft will be targeting the transports. Now Japan has to decide what it's doing. Japan definitely needs to take out that land-based aircraft, so I think they're going to devote 3 sections to attacking the land-based aircraft, and the other 2 will be in ground support. I don't want to go into that hail of anti-aircraft fire that we have, especially with that Atlanta. I think that could really chew up the aircraft quite substantially. So that will be the assignments for our strike aircraft. And we'll begin by resolving the airstrikes. We'll start with the U.S. You've got a total of 2 strike aircraft formations going after a destroyer and the Special Naval Landing Force. So that has, unfortunately, an anti-aircraft value of only a half, which will be rounded down to 0. So there'll be no anti-aircraft rolls. And the U.S. will be using their aircraft to try to sink those transports. And they're going to gain the following modifiers. They will gain +1. Target is an air or land unit as a part of a task force. So these rolls will be at +1. So we'll make the rolls and see if they get any hits on that Special Naval Landing Force. Here's the roll. And they have 1 hit. 4 becomes a 5. And that is a hit on the Special Naval Landing Force. So we'll mark that accordingly. Next up are the Japanese strikes, and we'll resolve the first one targeting the airfields in Port Moresby. We have a total of 3 strike aircraft included. Japan will be rolling 3 dice, and let's see what modifiers they get. And they will get nothing. It's going to be a straight up roll. The airfields will have some anti-aircraft ability to start. Port Moresby has a air capacity of 4, so that's going to give them an anti-aircraft ability of 2. So here is the roll. They're looking for 5s or 6s to down those aircraft. And they've got 2 hits. It is amazing. They've downed 2 aircraft. Only 1 is left for the strike on the airfield. That is amazing. Not good. So Japan will now launch their airstrike on the airfield and see if they can take it out. They're looking for 5 or 6. And they're successful. So that airpoint is destroyed. This aircraft will return. And now we'll take care of this will occur during the ground combat phase if we get that far. So we'll resolve the damage that we have, and unfortunately that hit on the transports, if the number of hits equal its reduced side, the formation is damaged. A damaged full-strength unit is flipped to its reduced side. So unfortunately, that is going to cancel the landings. We have no ability to land a damaged unit in an amphibious invasion. That is very unfortunate. So all of these aircraft are returned. And that is the situation we have here. Next step would be for sea control, but as our landings cannot take place, there's no point in doing that. We have no advantage to do it. So, in that case, there will be no land combat, and we'll move on to the administrative phase. And all of these forces now are going to be returned to their respective home ports. Now that hit on the Japanese transports is also going to reduce the Japanese transport level by 2. So that is going to be reduced now down to 10, and that's going to also affect the next turn. That will automatically reduce Japan's allotted amount by 2. So the American forces are returned to Pearl Harbor. And they're going to have to do any deployments they do from there. So we'll place those in Pearl. Japanese forces are returned to Kure. And the Special Naval Landing Force that was damaged is going to come in on the reinforcement track for next turn. So we'll place that on turn 5 of the turn track.
Sir, I regret to inform you that the landings at Port Moresby have been aborted. Strike aircraft from an American aircraft carrier have sunk a substantial number of transports, and thus the amphibious group was forced to abort its landings. Although our carrier force obtained air superiority, the commander of the amphibious group has reported that his task force lacks sufficient anti-aircraft capability to properly cover the invasion force. Regretfully, I have informed His Imperial Majesty of our failure.
So the forces in theater are returned. We have the 30th Australian Brigade back in Port Moresby, the 4 land-based aircraft in Rabaul, defended by the Ichiki Brigade. And that is going to bring the Japanese portion of the turn to a close. And we're going to move on now to the U.S. part of the phase, beginning with the reinforcement phase. The U.S. gets no reinforcements during turn 4. They do receive, though, 26 transport points. And they'll be going to their first deployments next. So in essence, the U.S. has managed to turn the Japanese invasion force back from Port Moresby, and that would have to be classified as a strategic victory. Tactical draw, but a strategic victory. So we'll move on now to the U.S. portion of the turn, and we'll begin with their first deployments. Now they have a total of 26 transport points, and I would think that the important part would be to get some ground forces into Port Moresby. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to do activating the 8th New Zealand Brigade in Samoa, and they're going to transfer that at a cost of 2 points to Noumea, and then spending another 2 points moving them into Port Moresby. That'll be a total of 4 points, moving them down to 22. I think the U.S. will also bring in some air assets into Port Moresby. It has a air capacity of 4, so I think what they'll do is they're going to bring in 2 points from Townsville, costing them 2 points, moving them down to 20. And I think another air point from Noumea, moving them down to 19. And I believe they're also going to transfer this force from Espiritu Santo into Guadalcanal. That is its capacity of 2. That'll move them down to 17 transport points. And I think with their remaining 17 transport points, they're going to relocate some carrier forces to that area within reaction range of both Guadalcanal and Port Moresby, and await the next Japanese move. So we have to build a force that the U.S. is going to move down into theater. Now they only have 17 points left, and they're going to need to move twice a distance of more than 4 movement points. So we only really have 8 points available. So I think we're going to form the force with a carrier. We'll use the Lexington and Saratoga, that's 4. The Atlanta as a anti-aircraft light cruiser, that's 6. And 2 destroyers. And that's about all that they can do. These other forces will have to remain at Pearl. We just don't have the transports to move them. So that force is going to be activated, and then we're going to move that to the theater. So they'll spend 8 points to move that 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4 to Ellis, and another 8 to move them to Noumea, which has a capacity of 16. That leaves the U.S. with 1 transport point remaining. And I think the only thing that they could do is to try to move that land-based air unit in Samoa. They could use a 1-hex deployment. And Move that into Ellis, I guess. That's free. And actually, I made a mistake. When we moved these forces from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, that should have been free because that's a 1 hex deployment. So that's going to give the U.S. 2 points back. They actually have 3 transport points left. So I think they're going to use that to move this air group 1, 2, 3, 4 into the Ellis Islands. Ellis has an air capacity of 4. That gets it at least closer to the theater area. And that's going to bring the U.S. activations during their first deployment to a close. I think for the U.S. operational phase, what they'll do, we could make a strike against Rabaul. That might be in order. The other possibility would be to use the carrier task force, and well, they can't reach Truk because of the air zones of control. So they could use that force and make an attack with the land-based aircraft we have adjacent and make a strike on Rabaul's air assets. That's a possibility. But I think what they'll do is they're going to leave that carrier group in Noumea, and they're going to make strikes with these aircraft that they have from the adjoining spaces. So they're going to commit 2 air points to an attack from Port Moresby and 2 from Guadalcanal. And we'll see how that works out. Now they actually have 3 air points here in Port Moresby, but because it's divided in half, it wouldn't make any benefit to include that in the attack. So we'll launch an air attack on Rabaul. All right, so we have 4 factors of U.S. long-range aircraft, which equates to 2 air points. And Japan's forces in Rabaul have 4. So we'll begin with an air-to-air combat phase. Now this might be ill-advised, but we'll see what happens. Here is the roll. All right, Japan has done its duty. They have a total of 3 hits. The United States has none, so that's going to knock down all of the U.S. air points. And they have no strike capability, so that's going to end the encounter. But you're never at a loss to launch an attack with those aircraft. The attacker can't lose any of its air groups, only the defending player. So we'll put these forces back on the board. So we would move into the second deployment right now, and U.S. only has 1 transport point remaining, so I don't think they're going to be doing anything with that. We'll move on to the end phase, and that's going to bring the round to a close.
Sir, I have good news. The Allies have launched an air attack on our base in Rabaul. However, our superior pilots have succeeded in downing numerous Allied planes. Our air base in Rabaul received no damage.
We'll move on to turn 5, and that is the Japanese portion of the turn. And we'll begin with the reinforcement phase. Japan is going to gain the following reinforcements in Kure: the revived Special Naval Landing Force, the 2nd Division, and the Yamato, Musashi, the Junyo and Hyo aircraft carrier, and a destroyer, and those forces will be placed back up in Kure. As a part of their reinforcement phase, Japan is going to gain 19 oil points, and they're scheduled to have 28 transport points, but that's going to be reduced by 2 because of the transports they lost in the ill-fated invasion of Port Moresby. So we're going to mark that accordingly. As Japan had 1 oil stored from the previous turn, they're going to begin the turn 5 with 20 oil and now 26 transport. U.S. in their half is going to have 32 transport points. Japan did manage to keep a cruiser and a light carrier available in Truk. So we're going to have to move some forces south from Kure to get them into combat position for whatever operation Japan is going to plan. I think Japan is going to begin with spending 4 transport points, moving them down to 22. And they're going to move the 6th Division from Kure 4 spaces to Truk. Truk has a ground capacity of 4, so that's maxed out. So Japan has a total of 22 transport points remaining. Now if they attempt to do an amphibious invasion with the 6th Division, that's going to cost 8 points, so we have to reserve at least 8 for our operational movement when the time comes. So in theory, that moves us from 22 down to 14. We'd have 14 transport points theoretically available for other things. So I think what they're going to do is transfer a few carriers down there. They'll transfer Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the Jonyo and Hio. That'll cost 7, and we'll move them to Truk. Now there's an unlimited capacity of naval units in Truk Lagoon, so we have no problems with that. That moves us down 7 to 15 points. And we definitely have to include some anti-aircraft ability for this force. And I believe I'd love to take the Yamato along, but it's just too expensive. It costs us 6. So I think we'll have to do it with cruisers and destroyers. So we'll probably send a force of 2 cruisers and a destroyer. That would be a total of 5 points that we can send down there. Move that down. And that's going to bring our total down to 10. So we have 10 transport points left, and we have to preserve 8 in order to make the landings with the 6th Division. So I think what we'll do is use the last 2 points, and we're going to move some land-based aircraft into Leh. We'll transfer the one from Palau and the one from Truk. That'll give us a total of 2 there. And that will move our transports down to 8. And that's just enough to pay the cost to transport the 6th Division to Port Moresby. And one last thing we're going to do before we move on to the operational phase is I'm ordering Colonel Kawaguchi to cross the Owen Stanley Ridge and launch an attack on Port Moresby. All right, now we're going to go to our operational phase, and I think the only chance we're going to have is to try an amphibious invasion supported with that land attack from Leh, starting in Truk, and we'll try to move the 6th Division into Port Moresby with an amphibious landing. We'll use the available forces we have. Right now we have 8 transport points left, so we're going to spend those to get the 6th Division onto transports, and we'll set up a amphibious invasion task force. Now we're going to have to give this thing some more anti-aircraft, there's no doubt about that. So I'm going to begin by setting up 2 cruisers and a destroyer, and that's going to form our amphibious invasion group. Now that's going to use up a total of 5 oil. That's going to move our oil down to 15. And then we're going to use the rest of our oil points to set up a carrier group, and that's going to consist of the Jonyo and Hio, Shokaku, Zuikaku, the light, light carrier Zuiho and Shoho, and a cruiser. Now we don't have to worry about sub-attacks in this scenario, so that's great. So we don't need to have the destroyers there necessarily. So we're going to have this force activate as a carrier support group, and that's going to be 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 oil points. That'll move our oil down to 4. And then we're going to move those forces towards Port Moresby. So our amphibious invasion group is going to move. I got to flip those to the activated side. Yep. And that force is going to move 1, 2, and 3 into Port Moresby, and the carrier group will also do the same. And that's going to be the extent of our operational movements. We're going to move on to the reaction phase, and I think what we're going to do is I don't see how the U.S. would not use their operational intelligence to utilize gentlemen do not read other people's mail. And we're going to use that to activate the task forces that we have in Pearl Harbor and get them into reaction range. Now the U.S. has 32 transport points. And I think what they'll do is get a carrier task force together here and move that down into probably the capacity is going to have to cover. Right now in Noumea we have a total of 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 points left. So if we build a task force of 8 points, that would be enough where we can have that in Noumea. So I guess what we'll do is create it with the Wasp and Hornet, a couple cruisers, and a destroyer. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's not enough. Or that's too much, rather. So that would be 9 points. We wouldn't be able to house that in Noumea. We have to have the destroyers come along, so we'll have to leave a cruiser out. So it'll be a force of 7 points. And that's going to move from Pearl to Ellis. That'll cost 7. And another 7 to get it to Noumea. So that's 14 transport points. And that's going to leave the U.S. with 18 transport. So now the U.S. is going to form reaction task forces, and this is the total number of forces that they have available in Noumea that is in range of intercept. So we'll form it into 2 carrier task forces. First force will be Lexington, the Atlanta, a Benham, and Farragut class destroyer. That's going to move and react into that space. And then the second carrier task force will be Wasp and Hornet, the New Orleans, and a Benson class destroyer. And that will also move into the space in Port Moresby and react to the Japanese attack. We'll move on to the air commitments phase, and Japan is going to commit the land-based air from Leh and both land-based air from Rabaul into the attack. We'll move on to our combat phase, and we'll set this up on the battle board. All right, so the Japanese are going all out in an attempt to take Port Moresby. Japan is organized into 1 carrier task force. I've split these up so we can see them. That is a total of 9 air points. They also have 3 points of long-range aircraft. 6 divided by 2 is 3. It's going to give them 12 air points. The U.S. has a total of 8 carrier-borne squadrons and 3 points of land-based air, giving them 11. The 30th Australian Brigade and the 8th New Zealand Brigade are in Port Moresby. The Kawaguchi Brigade has crossed the Owen Stanley Ridge and is ready for combat. It's hoping to see the arrival of the 6th Division by amphibious assault. We'll begin the combat resolution by going to our submarine attack phase. Japan has 2 tactical sub-units. They're going to apply 1 against each carrier task force. And we'll see what the U.S. anti-submarine warfare strength is. On the Lexington group, they have a total of 2 destroyers. So they'll be rolling 2 dice. They get +1 because we have aircraft present. So the U.S. will be rolling 2 dice +1. And they have failed. Amazingly, they have a 4 and a 3. So that means that the Japanese tactical subs are now in position, a firing solution, and they're going to target the Lexington. This will be a D6 roll, no modifiers. On a 5 or 6, the Lexington and Saratoga are torpedoed. Here is the roll. And they've done it. We have a 6, and that is a hit against the Lexington and the Saratoga. That is amazing. We'll consult our naval damage check table. We're going to roll 2 dice. And the modifiers are going to include +2 for submarine hit. Here is the roll. Now we're attempting to target the Lexington and Saratoga. That has an armor rating of 10. So we're adding 2 to this roll. Here is the roll. They've rolled a 10. That's modified to a 12. And the Lexington and the Saratoga have been sunk. That is awesome. Absolutely awesome. That is going to reduce the U.S. air points by 4 because that contingent of aircraft is no longer in the battle. So that'll move them down from 11 down to 7. Now we have one more sub-attack coming, and that is going to be against the Wasp and Hornet task force. That only has a anti-submarine warfare value of 1. So the U.S. will be rolling a die, getting +1 for the air cover in the area. Here's the roll. They rolled a 6, that's modified to a 7, and they've sunk the Japanese tactical sub. But the damage has been done, and the Japanese subsurface forces have sunk the Lexington and Saratoga. And the loss of that carrier is enormous. We're going to begin now with our air combat. Japan will be rolling 12 dice. The United States will be rolling 7. There'll be no modifiers to this air combat. As we're rolling so many dice, I'm going to do this separately. This is the Japanese air combat roll. They're looking for 5s and 6s, 12 dice. And Japan has done pretty well. They've got a total of 4 hits, it looks like. 5. They have 5 hits. 5 hits are scored, and that's going to move U.S. air power down from its 7 down to 2. That's what they actually have for operational aircraft left. Now the U.S. is going to make their rolls. They'll be rolling 7 dice, no modifiers. And we'll see what happens. U.S. has rolled a total of 2 hits. They've knocked down 2 squadrons. That'll reduce the Japanese levels from 12 down to 10. And that will be the number of airstrike aircraft that will be available. Japan has 10 squadrons available for airstrike. U.S. has 2. This is going to give Japan air superiority. The U.S. will have to assign their targets first. And this is going to be a little harder. If they target the transports, they need to get 2 hits in order to actually damage that unit. So I don't know if that would be a good tactic for them or not, or if those 2 points should be placed against the aircraft carriers. That is a tough decision. I'll bring up the Oracle table, and we'll let the Oracle decide how these U.S. aircraft are going to be, what their targets will be. I think this is a 50-50. And I guess if I were the commander at this stage of the game, knowing that the U.S. actually has the victory points right now, but they have lost that carrier, that's also going to affect things. I think I will launch them on an airstrike against the Japanese carrier force. Now, we'll make the roll and see if the commanders agree with me. We'll say this is a 50-50. And we're looking just for a yes or no. The result is a 6, and that's no. So that means that they overrode my choice, and they're going to attack the transports instead. All right. Now, the Japanese have to decide what they're going to do. The U.S. has technically 2 task forces now. This one is a separate task force. There's no carrier left, though, but that's the only carrier task force they have left. So we have to get rid of this land-based aircraft. There's no doubt about that. Any points that remain will cause automatic hits against whatever land forces were able to land, and those would cause automatic hits during the combat resolution. So I think we're going to devote 4 squadrons to air base attack. And This is where it gets tricky. Our choices would be ground support or to attack the carrier battle group. And we have a total of 6 squadrons left. I could split them 3 and 3. The anti-aircraft strength of that is 5, so we could probably expect about 2 losses there. So I think what I'll do is I'll put 4 strike aircraft into the attack on the American carriers, and we'll have 2 dedicated to ground support. That's how we'll do it. We'll begin by resolving the U.S. attack on the transports. Japan has a total of 2.5 anti-aircraft points, so that will round down to 2. So we'll roll the 2 dice and see if we can knock down some of those attacking U.S. carrier aircraft. They have no hits, so both of those are going to get through, and they're going to attack the transports. The U.S. strike aircraft will gain a +1 because their target is an air point, air or land unit as a part of a task force. So here is the roll, +1. And they have scored no hits, amazingly. That became a 3, that became a 4. So both of those have missed the targets. The transports are intact. All right. Next, we're going to resolve the Japanese attack on the air base in in Port Moresby. So we have a total of 4 attacking aircraft. Japan will be rolling 4 dice, and there is no modifiers to this. The air base has an anti-aircraft value of 2, so the U.S. will be rolling 2 dice in anti-aircraft. They've got 2 hits, so they managed to knock down 2 of those coming in. Allied anti-aircraft has been very effective. Okay, now Japan is going to roll 2 dice and attempt to take out those air points. They're looking for 5s and 6s. And they have no hits. That is very unfortunate. So those aircraft fly back. And now 3 points of damage are going to be inflicted by the remaining land-based aircraft during the ground combat phase. That is not good. Now we have the Japanese attack of 4 squadrons going after the Wasp and Hornet. They have an anti-aircraft defense of 5. So the United States will be rolling 5 dice for anti-aircraft. Here is the roll. That's a cocked die. We'll re-roll that. And they have 2 hits. They've knocked down 2 squadrons before they could launch their torpedo attacks. Japan has 2 squadrons coming in, and they're setting their sights on the Wasp and Hornet. So Japan will be rolling 2 dice. Let's see if we have any modifiers for this. There is not. So 2 dice, we're looking for 5s and 6s to get hits. Here is the Japanese torpedo attack. They have no hits. Oh boy. So those squadrons return to their carriers with no success. All right. Next, we're going to move on to our surface combat rounds, and Japan is going to send in all, well, the U.S. can't respond. They have no bombardment task forces, so I think they'll just send in the destroyer screen to get control of the sea. We'll keep these 2 cruisers as bombardment, and then we are going to land the 6th Division in Port Moresby. That is great. Japan has sea control, and that means that the Japanese ground units during combat are going to be supplied. They will be hitting on 5s and 6s. The U.S., or I should say the Australian and New Zealand forces, are now out of supply, and they will only be hitting on 6s. It's a big difference. Now they have there's 2 ground attack squadrons there, and we'll have to resolve that next. We'll start with the ground support. There's no modifiers. We would have to have had air supremacy to get that. So we're going to combine this into 1 ground support roll. We get 1 each for the aircraft and 1 point each for the gunnery strength of the cruisers providing bombardment. So it'll be a total of 4 dice, and we'll be hitting on 5s and 6s. Here is the roll. And Japan has one hit. So we inflicted one hit on one of the ground contingents at that location. So we'll apply that to the 30th Australian Brigade. That will be the end of the ground support aspects of this. And next up is our land combat. Japan will be rolling a total of 6 dice, and they'll be hitting on a 5 or 6. We'll take care of the Japanese attack right now. Japan scored 2 hits. So we will apply 2 hits to the ground forces. Total of 3 there now. Now the Australians and New Zealanders will counterattack. The existing land-based air is going to dish out 3 hits on the Japanese forces. Then they're going to be rolling 4 dice, but they're only going to be hitting on 6s. So we'll see what happens with that. Here is the roll. And they have no hits. So this is the current status we have. 3 hits for the attackers, 3 hits on the defenders. When that occurs, nothing happens. No one takes any damage. So we have a contested Port Moresby with the 6th Japanese Infantry Division, the Kawaguchi Brigade, the 30th Australian Brigade, and the 8th New Zealand Brigade. All right, that will conclude the land combat, and now the forces will return to their home bases.
Sir, the Imperial Navy has sunk the American aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga. In addition, our forces have landed in Port Moresby and have successfully established a beachhead. However, Australian and New Zealand forces have held their positions under intense fire. For the moment, Port Moresby remains under Allied control.
All right, what an exciting battle. The Japanese pushed it right to the edge. I think we did as best as we could with that. What really hurt us was the fact that we assigned 4 squadrons to base attack to try to wipe out the air forces in Port Moresby, and unfortunately the flak did a number on us and we weren't able to score any hits, and those land-based air units there dealt 3 hits to us. We would have done some real damage here if we could have taken out that land-based aircraft. So for your games, make sure that you put enough assets into taking out enemy land-based aircraft in an invasion area. It's very important. Those things come back and get automatic hits against you if you don't get rid of them. So that is going to complete the turn. We'll move on to the U.S. part of the turn, and we'll begin with their reinforcement phase. And the U.S. is going to gain the following reinforcements: a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, Fletcher-class destroyer, and the 25th Division that will appear at Pearl Harbor. Now, I've chosen to preserve that initiative. We could have used that during that air raid on Port Moresby, and maybe I should have. That would have allowed us to re-roll those dice. But that initiative is worth 2 victory points, and Japan needs all of them that they can get, I think, at this point. All right, the United States now has 18 transport points remaining. And that's what they have available to try to get some units from Pearl into the theater. So that means that the U.S. is probably going to develop a carrier battle group and try to move that down to Noumea, and then use the operational movement to launch an attack on the Japanese ground forces in Port Moresby. I think that makes sense. So they'll be able to build a task force the size of 9, basically, because we're going to need 2 moves to get it down to Noumea. We don't pay for operational movement for the U.S. other than if it's ground forces or air forces moving amphibiously. So let's see what they'll do. Well, the U.S. only has 1 operational carrier available, and that is the Wasp and Hornet, so that will be used. That'll be 4 points. They don't need to worry necessarily about destroyers because the Japanese have used both of their subpoints. So I guess logically they would still have one come along. You wouldn't have it move without anti-sub capability. They'll bring along the Atlanta. Well, maybe not. They need firepower for ground support. So I think they'll bring along the New Orleans. That's a total of 7. And the Portland, that'll be 9. So that force is going to form up in Pearl Harbor. And it's going to move 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4 to Ellis. And we'll spend another 9 points to move that to Noumea. All right. We'll move on now to the operational movement. They're going to activate the force, and they will move it 3 spaces to Port Moresby. And they'll use that carrier force to attack the Japanese ground units in that area. I think we might have to divide this into 2 task forces, though. And I think we'll do that. The Wasp and Hornet will go with the Benson, and the 2 cruisers will form a bombardment task force. So we'll do it that way. Unfortunately, the Japanese have no ability to respond. They have no surface assets that they can bring into this conflict. So they're just going to have to take their lumps. The U.S. will assign those air points to Port Moresby in its own hex. We'll set it up on the battle board and see what happens. All right, we'll start our combat sequence, and we'll begin with our air combat. There won't be any. U.S. has a total of 7 air points, 4 carrier-based and 3 land-based. That's 7 points. It's uncontested, so that means that the U.S. is going to gain air supremacy. It's going to give the U.S. 7 air points, and those are going to be all used all of those will be used for ground attack. There's nothing else that they can do. So they're going to apply all 7 of those to ground attack. Then we'll move on now to our surface combat rounds. The New Orleans and the Portland will move in, taking, well, only one of them can move in. That's true. You got to take sea control because that will deny the Japanese supply. Even though there's a land route going to Leh, if you have sea control, it's enough to make the opponents unsupplied. That's in the rules. I had to change batteries, so I apologize for that. Okay, so we're going to have to make this ground attack roll separately from the bombardment force because those forces with air supremacy get a +1 modifier. And that reads, player has air supremacy and air point providing ground support. So they're going to make 7 dice rolls with a +1. And here's the roll. All right, they've got quite a few hits here. Japanese didn't get any anti-aircraft because they are not in possession of the base. So that did a total of 4 hits, and we'll mark them accordingly. We'll place 4 hits on the Japanese forces. Then the U.S. also gets 1 roll for the gunnery strength of the New Orleans, which is providing bombardment. And that one does not get a die roll modifier. Offshore bombardment is always just a 5 or 6. That's a miss. Okay, so that is the ground support. These planes will fly back to their carriers and their bases. And now we will undertake land combat. Allied forces are in supply. The Japanese forces are not. So what we have here is the U.S. will be rolling a total of 4 dice, and they will be hitting on 5s and 6s. Here's the roll. They have no hits. Japanese will counterattack with 6 dice, but as they are unsupplied, they're only going to be hitting on 6s, so that's going to be very difficult for them. And here's the Japanese roll. And they have no hits, unfortunately. So the battle will end with 4 hits against the Japanese defenders, no damage against the attacking force, and now we have to apply this damage. And I have to see how this damage is allocated when you've got multiple units in there. And it simply says that if the phasing player's total is greater than all of the non-phasing player's units, they're all affected, and they will be flipped from full strength to reduced strength. In order to defeat these forces outright, the U.S. would have had to have scored 7 damage points. That would exceed the damage factors on the units, and then they didn't score any hits on the Americans, so a 7 would have exceeded that total and they would have been completely destroyed. But in this case, they're still hanging on. And that is the resolution of the ground combat in Port Moresby. So that's going to complete the scenario, and all we have left is to add up the victory points. And what we have for victory points is the Japanese have a total of 3 for sinking the Lexington and Saratoga. And they're also going to gain an additional 2 because they kept initiative and they never used it. And that's worth 2 victory points. So Japan has a total of 5 victory points. Now we'll add up the U.S. forces and what they have. They have control of Port Moresby, and that is going to net them a total of 8 victory points for Port Moresby. They also gain 6 victory points for control of Guadalcanal. So we'll subtract out the 5 positive from 5 negative, and we finish with -9, and that is going to be an Allied victory. Anything -2 or less, and it's an Allied victory. So the Allies have defeated us in the battle for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands.
Sir, although your strategy to defeat the Americans was sound, our forces have failed to achieve our objectives in Operation MO. His Imperial Majesty has been informed of our failure, and I regret to inform you that you have been relieved of command and have been ordered to return to Tokyo on the next transport.
So, thank you so much for joining me at the Solo Gamers Club. I hope you enjoyed this playthrough of Scenario 6, Guadalcanal Campaign for Fire in the Sky, the Great Pacific War, 1941 to 1945. And I hope you found this game interesting. It's an abstraction, of course, on a grand strategy level, but I'll tell you, the designer really did a masterful design with this game. It's a grand strategic game, but you actually have a tactical feel to it when you're assigning those aircraft to attacking carrier task forces, ground support, counter-air, attacking those aircraft in their enemy bases, ships at anchor. It really is a wonderful design, and I'm sure that this title will be coming back to the channel in the future at some point. So, this is Keith from the Solo Gamers Club signing off and wishing everyone a pleasant day. Good night.